Hey, Dr. Kraus, and just a little introduction to this video on the Pastoral Epistles. And I thought you might enjoy a little reminder of the campus of Nebraska Christian College. Pastoral Epistles are loaded with wonderful stuff for us as Christians, and especially those that want to be church leaders. So they are old books, but very contemporary in a lot of ways. And I'm going to lift up a few of the passages of Scripture and hope you enjoy this video. So the pastoral epistles are three: First Timothy, Second Timothy, and Titus, and that's the order they come in our New Testaments. However, that's probably not the order they're written in. They're written to these young pastors. This is why they're called the pastoral epistles. And two of them are to Timothy, who we know quite well, appears in a lot of Paul's letters, shows up in the book of Acts. We'll talk about him a little bit more. And one to Titus, who is not in the book of Acts, but also shows up in the book of Galatians. So these are all young proteges of Paul, both of them, and this is why we call them the pastoral epistles. So who wrote these letters? I'm just going to say I believe that Paul wrote all of these letters. I am an advocate, a conservative advocate for the Pauline authorship of all the books in the New Testament that claim to be written by Paul. If they were edited later a little bit by the early church or by some disciples, I don't have a problem with that, but I do think that these are authentic letters of Paul. Having said that, and you'll see this in the Erdman's Companion, there are some people, a lot of New Testament scholars, who do not believe that these are really written by Paul. They believe that they were written later by a well-intended disciple or person in a church, maybe a community, who puts these letters together for their own purposes. And I want to give you at least three reasons here why the authorship of Paul is questioned in these letters. These books are probably the most attacked books in the New Testament when it comes to the question of authorship. There are lots of relatively conservative scholars who do not think that Paul wrote these letters, so they are put in a category by themselves. And one of the reasons here, they don't fit into the history of Acts. So Acts ends in AD 62, probably. Paul's still waiting. He's under house arrest or kind of in a prison situation in Rome. And he's waiting for his hearing before Caesar. We think historically, the Acts doesn't tell us what happens, but we think he never had that. And in fact, he is released a little bit later. But these books are after that time, AD 62, as we'll see on the dating. So they're not going to fit into the history of Acts. I think that's kind of a dumb criticism. But more significant is these books show a more developed state of church governance. So by the time you get to the pastorals, you've got the people running the church leaders have titles, and it's sort of bishop, elder, and deacon, although a lot of people would think bishop and elder are basically the same office, but these are all three of these are addressed in the pastoral epistles. And so this is something that a lot of church historians want to say, well, this doesn't happen until the end of the first century, maybe 20 or 30 years after the time of Paul, and some would even date them later into the first century because of that. And I think that's sort of shooting in the dark. But maybe a more significant reason, and I will listen to this, is physically, we do have some relatively early lists of the books for the New Testament, or at least of the lists of the letters of Paul. And one of those, one very famous one called the Muratorian Canon, does not include the pastoral epistles. And it dates from the mid-second century, so somewhere around 150 AD 150, something like that. Well, I got to say that's an argument from silence. The fact that they're not on the list doesn't really mean anything except they're not on the list. We don't know the reason for that, but they're not listed as being false letters of Paul. So I think, again, that argument is kind of hard for me to swallow. So in the end, I would say the arguments against Paul being the author are not convincing, at least not to me. And we have to take into account these books are written probably 10 years after the time of the book of Romans. And that would make them, if Galatians is written in AD 49 and these are written in 67, nearly 20 years, 18 to 20 years after the time of Galatians. So are they going to change? Are circumstances going to change? Is the vocabulary and style of writing even of Paul going to change? When I look back at stuff that I wrote 20 years ago, and I have a lot of things that I wrote for publication, my style has changed. My tone has changed. My vocabulary has changed. So I think those are pretty harsh judgments and somewhat naive. So I'm pretty convinced that these are authentic letters of Paul. So when did he write these letters? We've talked about this a little bit already. We would say it's after the end of the book of Acts, so AD 62, because he's not in prison. Well, he is actually in 2 Timothy, but this is, we think, his second imprisonment. And according to church history, Paul is put to death AD 66, maybe 67 in Rome. He comes back to Rome. He's probably gone to Spain on a missionary journey. Some people think he gets all the way to Great Britain in this period. There's tradition about that, but he comes back to Rome during this time of persecution, and that's where he's executed. So somewhere in that 4 or 5 year period, this is when these books are written. And I tend to think they're toward the end of that period, maybe 65, 66, or even 67. 2 Timothy then is the last book that Paul writes. And I really think it's written shortly before his execution. Let's take a look at something here. So if we look at 2 Timothy chapter 4, we get a little bit of an idea of the circumstance of Paul when he's writing. He says, "For I'm already being poured out like a drink offering," meaning he's almost empty. His life is almost empty. The sands of his hourglass are almost done. His jug of wine is almost poured out. And the time for my departure, meaning his death, is near. And then these great words: I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. Those all mean the same thing. He's talking about the same thing, that he has been faithful to the end. He's not faltered. He is not given into temptation to give up. He's been faithful all the way through. And going on, now there is in store for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day, not only to me, but also to all who have longed for his appearing. In the last 20 years or so of my life, these words have really become important to me because I want to finish strong. I graduated with a Bible college class over 40 years ago, and we were all going to do these great ministries and change the world and just make this gigantic impact. Well, the end of it is that there's only one other person in my class I know who finished his life in ministry. He's passed away now, but he was in ministry till the end. All the rest of them left. They dropped out of ministry. Some of them dropped out of even involvement in churches, and a couple of them even dropped out of the faith. They didn't stay Christian. And boy, I don't want that to be me. I want to, when I'm done, when I'm retired, I want people to say he finished strong. And I don't want that for you either. I want you to jump into ministry with both feet as a lifelong commitment. So at the end, you too can say, I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. I have kept the faith. So he writes to these two young pastors, and let's start with Timothy, whose name means one who honors God. It's a really great name. Timothy is a person that Paul encounters in his second missionary journey. This is in Acts chapter 16, right after the Jerusalem Council, where they've just decided that Gentiles don't need to be circumcised, and they open the church up to everyone. And he retraces some of his steps in the first journey. He ends up in a little town called Lystra. He's got his companion, this time not Barnabas, but Silas. And there he runs into Timothy, who apparently he didn't not mentioned when he's in Lystra before. And Timothy is this young man, and let's look at some of his circumstance. It, Paul writes to him this in 1 Timothy. He says, I'm reminded of your sincere faith, which first lived in your grandmother Lois and in your mother Eunice, and I am persuaded now lives in you also. So what we see in Timothy, according to Acts chapter 16, he's this guy who his mother is Jewish, but his father is not. He's a Gentile. He's not part of the church. And by the way, it never says that they're married. I don't know how this works. It's not that Eunice's husband was a Gentile. It doesn't say that. So I think what you see here is kind of what you get pictured, this single family or mother only, women only, head of household family with no father. And yet they raised this young man well. This is what Paul says. Now, when he gets there, he finds out that Timothy, even though there's this Jewish tradition behind him, he's never been circumcised. So Paul is a rabbi and he knows how to do that. He's been trained how to circumcise people. He goes ahead and does this for Timothy, which I'm sure was very painful at age 16 or something. But he does that so that he's not going to be in any way offensive to Jewish believers. He's not doing it for salvation or any other reason like that. But Paul takes Timothy under his wing, under his protection, and Paul's is a guy who he never married. He didn't have any children. Timothy is as close to a son as he has, and he refers to him that way in language he doesn't really use of anybody else. My son, Timothy. He's very proud of him, and he's very concerned about him. And so in the circumstance of this letter, Paul's ended up with Timothy being in Ephesus, this church that he has a lot of connections with, and he's really wanting him to be successful. And so he writes both of these letters to Timothy to help him in his ministry. So lastly, the other guy is Titus. Now, Titus isn't mentioned in the book of Acts, but he is mentioned in the book of Galatians. And what we put together there is that when Paul goes to the Jerusalem Council for this big confab on the necessity or non-necessity of circumcision, he takes Titus along. And you might remember that video we watched in class of that, where they're up on the platform and these guys are meeting around and it's really tense, and these two kind of bully guys are like, well, we think he ought to be circumcised, and kind of I always say, well, and I've got the knife, I'm ready to do it right now. And Anthony Hopkins is Paul goes, no, which I just think is a great line. But this is Titus, so he's always a Gentile. He's never circumcised. He never becomes a Jew, but Paul loves him and trusts him, and maybe not quite the same level as Timothy. But interestingly, the background of the book of Titus is that he's on the island of Crete, which is this big island out in the Mediterranean Sea. And the people in Crete had bad reputations in the ancient world. They were seen as almost, kind of hillbillies, almost savages. And somehow a church has been planted there. We don't know if Paul was there or not. I assume he probably was at some point. We don't know when. But this church is having all kinds of issues. And part of it's just the sort of low character of these Cretans. And so Paul has sent him there to put this church in order. And he sends this letter to maybe give him some authority, but also to give him some guidance. So letters to two young pastors, and the next video we'll look at some of the texts. Thank you.